and welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by Heimdall, the lead economist at a fully on-chain game called the Citadel. For those who are not familiar, the Citadel is a space-themed, fully on-chain MMO. Welcome to the show, Heimdall.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me on it.
Before we get into the meat of the questions, what games are you currently playing?
You know what? In the process of working on a fully on-chain game, you don't have a lot of time to actually play games. But I guess I tend towards the classics. I'm playing a bit of Diablo 2 Resurrected right now. Little TFT, League of Legends game. That's pretty much it, actually.
Did watching Arcane get you like reinterested in League of Legends? It did for me.
It did make me want to play like the actual game. Actually, yeah, you can't really say anything without spoiling it for anybody who's watching who hasn't watched the show yet. But yeah, Vander is like my favorite character in the game, and it's pretty rough watching this show. I don't know, Jackal, have you watched Arcane?
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
I get the feels every time. Like they're so good at that storytelling, and I dig the art style as well. Yeah, it was excellent.
I'm using it as like an intro to anime now. It's like actually an intro to like anime and gaming. I'm like sending it to
Yeah.
everybody. It's like, oh, you liked Arcane? Okay, here's my list of like 1,000 other anime you should go watch now. Oh, you like this game? Well, maybe don't play League of Legends because that one's gonna be a little tough. I'm trying to send them to play like Hades or like even like an ARPG like Diablo first before getting into League because
Yeah.
I don't know. League already makes me want to punch a hole in the wall. So
I also think it's like an excellent benchmark, I guess, for bringing franchises outside of gaming.
Yeah, I think anime is definitely the way to go versus like live action. You see movies like this Assassin's Creed movie or like Prince of Persia that just turned people off completely to the genre, and then you see Arcane, which is basically like a masterpiece, and it's all done through animation. You're like, yeah, it's a video game, man. Just keep it animated.
All right, so to kick things off, I think one of the fundamental challenges that are facing a lot of teams building in this space of like fully on-chain gaming is that you have inherently higher costs to like run the service, like costs of goods sold, and then it just makes it a lot more challenging to kind of figure out unit economics. And so I see quite a few teams in this kind of push and pull dynamic where they're trying to increase or decrease the underlying costs of building on this infrastructure, trying to reduce the cost for acquiring new users. And I think lastly and most importantly, increase the LTV, right? Improving monetization. And so on that last topic, I'm curious what monetization models you consider to be like best suited for this like niche genre of gaming.
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, we always were planning on doing like a royalties focused model, even with version one of Citadel. It always seemed like the most scalable method that wasn't just a single time NFT mint and then another NFT mint, or we do a token sale, or we sell some new assets, or a lot of games are trying to do battle passes just like traditional Web2 games. Royalties are recurring. It's a sign that your game economy is doing well because there is consistent demand and transaction volume. The problem, of course, is that if you don't have any demand or volume, then you have no monetization. So, you need to structure your economy so that there is some sort of inherent demand for the assets. And from the beginning, that's always been the way we thought about structuring the game economy, is how can we make sure that there's some base level demand for the assets at all times as people are playing the game, and that everything sort of has like a lower bound value in a sense, so that even if it does trend towards that lower bound value, that there's going to be people waiting there to be there on the bid side. Um, yeah. So with 2.0, we're just going for a fully tax driven model. basically encouraging, open trade between players, and how can we increase the velocity of trades between players, and just taking a percentage fee of that, as basically a way to fund the future development of the game.
Similar games in Web 2 world quite often like to leverage a subscription model as a more predictable revenue stream to fuel live ops. Is this something you guys have considered?
Yeah, and well, to be completely honest, part of our monetization plan includes subscriptions. We're doing it a bit differently. Most of the subscription fees will go back to the player-controlled treasury. I think we'll probably be one of the first to do that, unless somebody takes the idea and launches quicker. But in order to have like a treasury-backed economy, which is kind of our full intention, you need to have some sort of inflow of a different kind of asset or token to the treasury. You can't just have native tokens going to the treasury, because then it's sort of like you have illiquid tokens in the treasury that you have to sell every so often. So we did need to figure out a strong flow of ETH to the treasury. And since most of the taxes and royalties in the game are going to be denominated in the native token, we lost that when we moved from the original royalty-driven model to like a tax-driven model. So subscription fees in ETH is going to be part of our plan going forward. And like I said, a lot of that's going to be going back to the value of the player assets. But something you can note from Eve is that they have a really good sort of model with their Plex model. And you can kind of think of it like this, where like players earn enough ISK in the game to cover their subscription fees in Eve a lot of the times, especially very good players. And so they're not really coming out of pocket US in dollar terms, or whatever Iceland's currency. I think it's also called ISK. In the same way, you'll see players who are good enough at earning the currency in like the Citadel, for say, they can just exchange it to ETH and pay their subscription fees. So they're not really coming out of pocket there. Yeah, so from 1.0, we carried over this similar kind of model that we had there, which is a dynamic sync model where the core sync in the economy is just one sync. And essentially, we don't have to have like you pay 5 tokens over here and you pay 15 tokens over here, and hopefully that adds up to balance the economy at the end of the month. That seems very difficult to do in something that's supposed to be decentralized and sort of run autonomously on its own without constant intervention from some god watching over the world. So we had to come up with a way that the currency burns would sort of manage themselves, and we wanted basically the players. Essentially, it's just a market equilibrium. So what we did was we created a method to sustainably inflate the governance asset through weekly auctions. We release a certain amount of governance assets every single week, and players can bid for those governance assets with the in-game currency. And the value would essentially be probably the pro rata value of the governance asset of the treasury, and then probably there's some added value based on the revenue that the treasury makes every month, and maybe some premium value if the governance asset has utility in the game. And essentially, what you would see is that driven by basically market dynamics, and players seeing the value of the governance asset, they would burn however many tokens by purchasing governance asset, and it would sort of dynamically reduce the supply every single week. And we were one of the first ones to actually simulate this with Machinations, and we did their first economy auditing program. And we were actually one of the first ones to ever pass the economy audit. I think we're still only like one of 5 projects that passed before they decided to stop doing it, or I don't know if they're still doing it, but yeah, and we saw that we would get a reducing curve, even if we had a static inflation of tokens, that we would get a reducing curve of token supply over time. And so we carried that model over to the second version of the game, and we fully intend to do something very similar.
Obviously, there's a lot of tokens in the land of crypto. Less gaming tokens, and even less gaming tokens that are, in my opinion, thoughtfully designed beyond kind of a governance asset. So I'm curious, like, beyond thinking about designing just tokens for crypto in general, Like, what are some of the main kind of nuances or some of the things that keep you up at night when designing a token for a game specifically, and specifically a game that exists, or specifically a token that exists within the game, rather than something that's like a hard currency that exists outside the experience?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issue with a lot of gaming currencies, we'll say, is that they don't have any source of like inherent demand. There's really no purpose for the token to exist other than to reward the players and then for the players to turn around and sell. And sometimes they do have some sort of utility in the game, but it's usually a pretty static cost, and it's never enough to overcome the inflation that players are always constantly selling. So if you don't have any sort of like inherent demand, or basically there's always a point at which players will decide to purchase the token, your token is probably going to just tend towards zero over time. And I think we've seen that a lot of times. Not so much governance assets, which have or governance tokens, which have a secondary bid from speculation once every 4 years, or whenever there's a hype event. But yeah, so we've thought about that a lot, and how can we drive players to need the currency, right? It's like if you had a country like let's just say the United States, and you went to the market and you could pay with anything, right? You don't need to use the U.S. dollar; you could use pesos if you wanted to. And let's say that the peso was actually better than the U.S. dollar, then people would just sell the U.S. dollar for pesos, right? But if you, like we do here, you cannot use pesos, right? The dollar is legal tender for all debts in America, right? In crypto, you can use whatever you want pretty much. And there's no friction to converting to other currencies at the last minute when you actually need it, right? So how do you keep players in the currency, and how do you get players to actually want to hold the currency? You have to make it a high demand currency. And for us, that was how we structured the world of the game. So, and obviously this is all theoretical. The game is not launched yet, but we basically thought, okay, if players want to project power into the game, then they need to bring money in through the liquidity pool, through the currency specifically. Well, if all the assets are on chain and they can just buy the assets on a marketplace, on a secondary marketplace, then they might as well just be, buying pesos or whatever. They can just bring money in through the NFTs, let's say ships or resources or whatever. But if you enclose everything in a country where you can say you can only pay for things with this currency in this world, then you don't have that problem anymore. Because once the money's inside the economy, it's in assets, right? And those assets can't leave the world. So they're all still fully on chain, but they're not tokenized and they can't be sold on secondary marketplaces. And they can't leave the world until the money goes out through the liquidity pool again, right? And sometimes those things they paid for get blown up, and then that liquidity just kind of stays there, right? Or obviously it transfers to the other person on the other side of the trade. But you get what I'm saying.
And then how are you guys ensuring that people must use your token? Is it that you got kind of like a whitelist or a blacklist kind of function? Is like, how are you guys going about doing that, especially in like a permissionless world?
Well, the world is all enclosed within the smart contracts of the game, so there's no whitelist needed per se, because everything exists within the world of the game. It's not technically. I'm not the most technical person, so I might be butchering this a bit, but yeah, essentially, like you want to use the marketplace at the space station in the game. Well, it's just not an option to use anything else, because that marketplace exists within the game contracts and the game state of the larger game, right?
So then the only assets that can be traded within the game have to be traded on that venue, and then that venue only takes native currency for swaps. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And that's how we enforce royalties too, because all the assets only exist on chain in the game. We can actually create our own logic for enforcing taxes in the marketplace in the game, which is a net benefit to all the players involved, because eventually when I have player on stations that can set their own taxes and things like that. So whoever owns the station is actually creating their own sort of business. A lot of things become possible, and really value aligned once you can create incentive models like that.
Could you maybe like talk a little bit more about the different ways in which you guys have designed like different incentive models to kind of incentivize the trade velocity within the game, right? If everything's underpinned by the royalties and you have all these different kind of loops within the game that different user personas will interact with. Yeah, I'm curious how you kind of think about, encouraging each of those people to trade.
Yeah, so the way we've done it basically is we tethered all the value back to the treasury. So you start with the governance asset, which is only auctioned off in the currency. And the currency obviously derives the value in terms of the value of the governance asset. But then we take that a step further, is the only faucet in the game is what we call a recycler, competitive recycler. It needs a better name, honestly. If you have any ideas, let me know. But what that is it's a static distribution of currency that occurs at certain space stations, and players can go there and recycle resources which have their own internal balanced point value. And there's essentially a competition for the next fauceting of currency. So that tethers the value of the resources back to the currency, which again is tethered back to the governance asset, which is tethered back to the treasury, which also receives revenue from the entire ecosystem. And then further, any asset in the game can be salvaged back into resources, so that also tethers the value back. You can think of this as a very natural form of money. Actually, it's sort of based on this old Egyptian thing that I heard about in an economic textbook somewhere. Essentially, it's called representative money. And back in Egypt, they had all this grain, right? But people would trade in grain, but eventually that became too cumbersome. So they created like a receipt type of model where you'd go store your grain at the silo. And this is kind of how original gold money started. But then you'd get a coupon that you could go and trade with people and say, okay, here's your coupon to go get the grain, right, at a later date. And so there was always some fundamental value to those coupons because you could always go retrieve the grain from the silo. You can think of the currency in our game as very similar because as long as you have this currency, you can always go get a governance asset at any time. If you have the correct amount and you beat everybody else at the auction. So it derives its sort of fundamental value like that. So in a way, it's sort of like a bond or maybe like a convertible note.
What is the value for, aside from the kind of like anchoring value that you have with the treasury and the governance assets? Why, like, how would you continually drive demand towards these governance assets? Like, if I already own one, why would I want to buy more?
Yeah, so people value in traditional DAOs having more voting weight, of course. I think that there's also an opportunity to create a sort of charter system for space stations where each player that wants to have ownership over a certain space station, kind of like a city, I guess you could say like a city charter. You would go and say, okay, I'm moving to this station. Let's say there's like 100 people there and they all have their governance asset there. They would actually just receive distributions back from the station based on taxes in the marketplace or any sort of services that were offered there. I think that would be a good way to drive value and actually, align value across the ecosystem. So some sort of utility would definitely be helpful, and something like that could be pretty cool because I think what I've always thought about for governance is that it lacks ownership of the world in most cases. They sort of exist on the outside. They're usually like a token, and it's kind of like I own like 1,000 governance tokens, and I kind of have ownership over this game, but not really. And I think what we're really missing is like the psychological ownership of the world. Like when I live in a city, I feel I'm from there, I'm repping my city, and so having your governance asset like exist in a place in the world, I think would be a really cool idea. And not only that, you're benefiting from making that place, prosperous, by earning a portion of the taxes collected or what have you. And then you also feel the need to protect it, right? This is my place. These are my people. I'm from this side of the Citadel. We don't like those guys from the other side of the Citadel. I think that kind of line of thinking is really interesting to me, and something that until now that you don't really have with governance tokens. Governance tokens are just kind of a thing that people own in their wallet, and nobody really cares about it, right? Until there's a vote, and maybe I vote, or maybe my vote doesn't really matter because somebody owns 50%.
When building virtual worlds that live on chain and can hypothetically live long past the day that the developers decide to shut down the servers, how important do you think concepts like entropy are?
Yeah, entropy, especially in like blockchain systems where things are essentially permanent to some extent, is an interesting concept. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would ever see the governance assets decaying per se, but I could definitely see like if you're not protecting your station where it's at, maybe it gets destroyed when somebody comes and kicks over your sandcastle. And I don't see any problem with that because a good player will have a lot of currency stored up and they'll just go get themselves another one. Um, yeah, so I think entropy is good, and I think that's something that I mean, destruction is good. Let's say because entropy has some different definitions, but
Maybe bringing it back to this concept of designing tokens broadly, and then specifically for games. I'm curious, how have meme coins affected your views on tokens broadly? It doesn't necessarily have to be just for games.
yeah, I think meme coins are great even before this current sort of fun time that we're having. Back in 2022, a lot of my ideas around taxes and liquidity and different kinds of staking mechanics were informed by meme coin developers that often just rug their token, but what they built was pretty interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot about a lot of things from meme coins. Just for example, how important community is. I mean, we've always said that, but of course we don't have a live token right now. Uh, there's definitely a fundamental value, and you can see that all the way back with like chain link and stuff like that, and like Marines is that having a sort of like cult community is the value of your token to some extent for most cases. If you don't have that, then it's all speculation and hype and attention.
So it sounds like distribution is very important, right? You have to distribute the token to that community, and that community has to be kind of actionable in some way. What about the liquidity profile of these coins? I'm curious, like how has the liquidity profile of meme coins, right? They change drastically over the course of the lifetime of a meme. Um, what, how has that informed your views about designing the economy for Citadel?
Yeah, I mean, liquidity is an interesting thing, especially in terms of, like, let's say Solana meme coins. They're much less liquid than Ethereum meme coins start out. And what you see is that they're fully non-distributed. Usually there's a lot of insider supply, or some people buy up a bunch of supply and then they get this liquidity shock essentially where there's not a lot of tokens in the liquidity pool and the token starts to pump once it outscales its most compressed state. And then you see those people distribute the tokens and the coin essentially gets heavy, right? As the coins get distributed, the price starts to fall. And because of the volume, the way that liquidity tokens work, the fees increase the size of the liquidity depth. And obviously, the larger the liquidity depth, the more volume you need to push the token back up. And so that's why you see these huge pumps and then they retrace 90% and most don't recover unless they, at that bottom level, accrue what we were just talking about is a very strong cult community who buys up all the supply in a distributed way, right? Because it's usually 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 people buying up, 0.5% or less of the token, and then it grows in a more sustainable way.
What do you think is the single largest value add of fully on-chain games? Like if you were to kind of shill it to a traditional gamer.
You're throwing me for the loop with that last part, and because I have something prepared for the biggest, but for a traditional gamer, I think it's really just that God no, but that it gets said so many times that's that they can't take your stuff, right? But really they can't get rid of your world. I guess more so than like Counter Strike can't take your skins. It's really that they can't just the sunset Counter Strike one day and all your skins are have no value anymore because of that. I think that's more critical than the ownership of the assets themselves. It's that the world is going to exist no matter what anybody does. Um, that's huge, and I think that is probably the most underestimated economic value of an on-chain game is that the world where the assets exist cannot be removed from existence.
As a final follow up, same question, but how would you shill fully on chain games to a VC?
I mean, what's the best business model in the world? It's a country, right? They can tax all their people as much as they want. I'm not saying we would do that because it's decentralized and people would have to vote for that. But having your own world that you can enforce taxes on is highly valuable, especially if you have a sustainable rate of growth and you have a value-backed economy and and a fun game, of course. But yeah, that's the simplest way I can put it, is that the model of a country is probably the best business model there is. And that's kind of what we're going for.
And that just about wraps it up for today. Really appreciate you, Heimdall, coming on. There's been, we had a good time chatting about tokens, economies, how you guys are kind of looking to build Citadel. And definitely excited to see when the game finally launches. Is one of the more like highly anticipated titles. And I think the graphical updates you guys have done recently are definitely like, I guess, made it more mainstream. So really excited for that. And yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, I know it's been a long time coming, but we're getting there. And I'm very excited about the direction we're going with the artists. Every time I see something from them, I'm like amazed that it's our game, So, but yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on board on the podcast again. It's always a good time chatting with you guys.
The content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.